there are medical trials taking place across the world, in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, using these psychoactive compounds on a one-off basis with people suffering bereavement, addiction, post-traumatic stress disorder, people facing inevitable death. I felt if I'm going to get a glimpse of any other kind of dimension, this will be the way to do it. And it turned out it was one of the most beautiful and meaningful experiences of my life. I had plans to write more of a kind of technical book, a sort of a roadmap for rewilding and restoring nature in Britain, which, as you know, is terribly depleted of nature. But from almost the first moment of sitting down to do that, it became obvious that my book needed to be a much more personal book, given the year of magical thinking that I had experienced, and the trauma that we had all experienced in our family. And yes, during the first year after Iris died, I did write little kind of letters to her on my Instagram, my private Instagram. And it was meaningful and somehow cathartic for me to do that. So kind of one thing led to the other, and I wrote a book about that year of searching for some ongoing trace of Iris, answers to questions that I'd never really thought about before in my life. Well, what happens to us when we die? Where do we go? Is there an afterlife? Could the belief in reincarnation that's held by billions of people around the world have some truth to it? I'm not sure I found any answers, but certainly the act of searching was important for me.
Well, you certainly did some forensic searching, which we'll go on to talk about in a moment. But I wondered before that if you would perhaps give our listeners a sense of who Iris was and what happened on that horrible, fateful day.
So Iris was my oldest child, just 22 and 20, Kate and I, when we had her. And she was a really sparkling girl, a really brilliant girl. I couldn't believe the number of people who thronged around a tree that came to be known as Iris's magic tree in Barnes, a place where she used to hang out in Barnes Common afterwards. And the number of people that thronged the church and the surrounding street on the day of the funeral. She touched an enormous number of lives because she was just a brilliant, intelligent, charismatic, strong and willful girl. And she was 15 and a half when we lost her, very, very suddenly, out of the blue, in a freak accident on our farm in Somerset. Rushed back to find that she hadn't made it. And I find it difficult now to conceive the idea that this girl that was so brilliant in preparation for her future, in every way, ultimately didn't have one. It's hard, I think the hardest thing for any parent to have to come to terms with. In my case, the light that started to appear through the darkness was really in the form of nature. We're lucky enough to live in a very vibrant part of England in South Somerset, where nature is all around us. And I found solace in such things as swimming in the river.
And it was a love of nature that Iris shared with you as well, didn't she?
Yeah, all my children have grown up in nature, and I've been obsessed with wildlife and nature since I was a child. So obviously that rubs off to some degree. And she was always off on her pony with her friends and looking for birds' nests and sending me little clips and videos of things that they'd seen. And she was in love with the natural world, Iris. And I think undoubtedly she would have gone on to become a champion for the environmental movement. She was going to do her first work experience with Client Earth, which of course is the NGO that uses the legal system in Europe to campaign on behalf of the natural world. That would have been her first foray into the world of adulthood and environmentalism. She wanted to be a barrister.
You describe in the book in great detail and also very vividly the day that Iris died and your sort of impressionistic sense of it. How difficult was it for you to revisit that day, or had you never managed to escape its clutches, as it were? I mean, I suppose that's an impossibility in a way.
Yeah, that's almost the hardest place to go mentally, is to think about the actual events of the day itself. So it was certainly gut-wrenching writing about it. But I think my book is quite an upbeat book. I mean, yes, the first chapter and the second are traumatic. They were hard to write. But really the book is one of hope and optimism, of solace and meaning and even joy in the natural world.
You looked, and we will go on to explore the natural world, but you looked in all directions really for solace and for to make some sense of this horrific thing that had happened. And you're absolutely right. The book is, although immensely sad, also very uplifting. But I know that shortly after Iris's death, I think you contacted a medium, and I was really interested in that because there was a huge explosion, wasn't there, of mediums and spiritualists after the First World War, when so many people had experienced loss, and clearly it's offered comfort, though I'm sure there are lots of people who would disparage it as a route to, finding your way through grief.
So I'm christened and confirmed a Christian, and really only because it gave me a week off school at the time. I've never been much interested in questions of spirituality or religion, really until I lost Iris. And I found solace in spending time with other parents who'd been through similar bereavements. And a handful of them suggested in the early weeks and months that I visit a medium. And I don't try to persuade any reader of the book or anyone listening now that what I experienced was real. That being said, in that moment, in the madness of my grief, spending time with someone who did something astonishing during an hour and a half in which I felt I had a conversation with my daughter, it was hugely comforting at a very difficult time. And it got me searching. I went to see the vicar several times in the church where we both live, you and I. I went to see a rabbi in Hendon several times. I was taken by a friend of mine who's a car mechanic from Sri Lanka. He took me to see a Buddhist monk at the Vihari in Acton. I was fascinated in this idea that the vast majority of people alive and the vast majority of people who've ever lived are of the view that we do survive death and we go somewhere, and that we are possibly even accessible wherever we go. I think things are not as simple as that. I've come to the view that we're part of a grand mystery that is beyond our ability to understand. It was Terence McKenna who said that the nature of reality is stranger than we can understand. It's stranger than we're capable of understanding. So I don't feel I've necessarily come up with any answers, except that we're part of a mystery. And I think that the visible manifestation of that mystery is nature.
And when you were talking to all of these people, and indeed the spiritualist who came quite swiftly in the aftermath of Iris's death, what were you looking for? Were you looking to be in the same place as Iris, to just feel a connection to her again, to explain or exonerate yourself for, perceived things past? What was it that you wanted to, or did you know?
I think the hardest thing to swallow when it comes to the death of a child is the injustice in the idea that their experience is simply extinguished. That's it. A kind of statistical anomaly, and their experience has gone finished into the blackness. And so I think at the time I wanted some reassurance that there is an ongoing existence, that Iris is somewhere magical, doing something magical, continuing to experience something. I think that's what I went searching for. And I've come to the view that I think on the balance of probabilities, it's more likely we do survive death in some way. But again, I think it's too simplistic, the way in which we tend to think about it. I think religions are a valiant and noble attempt to explain things which are not explainable. I have a sense of comfort that I will see my Iris again in some way.
You describe in the book this psychedelic drug experience, ayahuasca, which I think South America, I think it comes from, something you'd done when you were 19 and swore never to do again. You'd done in the middle of the Ecuadorian jungle, and then returned to. And on a serious level, I think that it did, in some way, as you describe it, incredibly vividly. I don't know how you can remember it in such detail, a trip like that as well. But you describe it very much as a mind-expanding, universe-expanding experience. But I struggled at first to get over the fact that I think they said you should wear loose white cotton clothing when you went through this very sacred ritual. And and your idea of informal loose cotton clothing was your cricket whites.
Well, those are sacred for me. I love my cricket. This experience was very un-me. The only reason why I considered it was because of the searching I'd been undertaking for a year, the kind of reading I'd done, and the fact that certain unexpected, quite surprising people suggested that this was worth exploring. There are medical trials taking place across the world, in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, using these psychoactive compounds on a one-off basis with people suffering bereavement, addiction, post-traumatic stress disorder, people facing inevitable death, people facing a whole range of different individual and collective difficulties. And the results are astonishing. And we should remember that every single indigenous society that's ever existed on any part of the planet has used some kind of psychoactive substance as part of a kind of coming of age or in moments of tribulation. You know, the Celts of Britain used to take psychedelic mushrooms before battle and so on. And so the idea was both terrifying and fascinating to me. And I felt if I'm going to get a glimpse of any other kind of dimension, this will be the way to do it. And it turned out it was one of the most beautiful and meaningful experiences of my life, almost certainly never to be repeated. But it was a turning point for me. Before I did this, I really wandered around in a state of sort of abject misery, really. It took a tremendous amount of effort to stay afloat. And afterwards, I look at everything in a different light.
You said that instead of the grieving, you suddenly saw all the beauty of your relationship with your girl, the unspoken love, the undeniable connection, the sort of incandescent joy of having had her as a 23-year-old dad and had her in your life. I thought that was really very touching.
I mean, it's quite a thing to be talking about on national radio that I did this, but I think these kinds of things, these kind of psychoactive compound experiences will become quite a mainstream part of mental health and a part of coping with the kinds of situations that I experienced. For me, it mattered hugely. It gave me a totally different perspective. And I felt for the first time since the accident an enormous, overwhelming gratitude for the relationship that I had with my daughter during the time she was alive. And for the previous year, all I'd thought about in connection with her was rage or sadness or grief, injustice. And for the first time, I just remembered how it was before. And that was enormously important for me.
You built an extraordinary stone circle on the site where your daughter died. And, that's just been a very small part, in a way, of the process by which you've gone around about rewilding the farm that you live on and in many ways motivated by her presence. A lot of people might have felt that they had to get away from the scene of something like that, but you've done the exact opposite. Why?
I associate her so strongly with the place where she grew up. I feel her presence there so strongly. She was such a little kind of wild child, the ringleader in her group of friends, and they were always up to something in different parts of our farm, and she loved nature and I love nature. We're fortunate enough to live in a part of Somerset known as Selwood, which is a derivative of the word sallow, which is another word for willow. And Selwood was a great wood pasture that stretched from Bath to Wincanton to Frome to Wells, 40 or 50,000 hectares at one stage. It's pretty low productivity farmland. It's mostly grade 4 or grade 5, quite difficult to farm it productively. And so several of us neighbours, 4 or 5 of us, are now in the process of re-establishing that wood pasture. And so in the place where the accident happened, the place where my children have grown up, we have little pockets of dog rose and crabapple and bramble popping up through the fields, and the hedges are billowing outwards, and there are beavers now on the stream that runs along the brook. We've now got, for the first time since I've been there, we've got glowworms in the dead of dark nights in the summer. You see them glowing in patterns above the beaver wetland. I mean, it's really quite magical what's happening there. And it's not just me, it's several farmers all adjoining. More than 1,000 acres going back to nature. We're still farming. We've still got our horned cattle, Old English Longhorns, and they mooch about. The difference is they're now free to roam where they want, eat what they want, sleep where they want, and they're in much lower numbers, which means they don't need supplementary feed. They stay out all year round. And they, of course, are a crucial engineer of this new woodland pasture that's emerging. And I feel Iris's presence there. It's for me, it's been a really important part of the healing process.
You talked about swimming in your pond, and particularly in the days after Iris's death, you just go and submerge yourself. And And today you're actually Instagramming about water again because there's some pretty bad flooding. It's been in the news actually in Somerset, and that is a project that you've embarked upon in I think just the last couple of years in terms of, changing the way that you use water on your land and the way water traverses your land. Tell me a bit about how important that is or should be to us all.
So in a river system, on average during the year, about 1% of the water is in the main river. The vast majority, 99-ish% of the water, is in the surrounding landscape. And nature designed our landscapes to act like giant sponges. The idea is that when it rains, the water is absorbed by ponds, by wetlands, by little wiggly streams, and into the soil itself, and then it is released slowly throughout the year. And so you have a much steadier flow of water down the main channel of the river. What we've done in the last century is we've engineered our landscapes to do the exact opposite. We've made the streams and the rivers dead straight. We've put ditches everywhere. We've filled every field with field drains. We've filled in the ponds. We've drained the wetlands so that when the rain comes, like it did on Tuesday morning in Somerset, it just deluges straight into the nearest person's living room. And we wonder why we get these flash floods. And it rains all winter, rains all spring, and then we go a month without rain, and suddenly we have hosepipe bans, and there's water shortages, and we're told we can't have power showers in our house. It's madness. It's a landscape problem. Flooding and drought are two sides of the same coin. We need to restore our landscape so that they can behave like the sponge that they were meant to be. And that's, I think, a simple agricultural policy question. The new environmental land management scheme is going to reward farmers with taxpayers' money if they do help to slow the flow by rewiggling their streams like we've done, by allowing beavers to come and do their thing on the land.
It's interesting you should bring up the beavers because you do mention them in the book, and I fear for the ancient oak that sits on the island in your pond. How do you convince people that, bringing back species like beavers, people like order. We like order, and we also, as a species, we like to feel like we're in control. That makes us feel good about, our participation in the world. And I suppose rewilding in many ways is a process of letting go, which is probably why it's such a theme in your memoir.
I mean, we like to think that nature is chaos and we are order. But in fact, the exact reverse is true. Nature is order. Nature knows how to handle deluges of rainfall. We bring chaos by forcing those deluges into the river channel and causing flooding. And on a smaller scale, when beavers move into a stream along the bottom of a valley, if you just give them 10 or 15 meters space on either side of the stream, just set the fences back and give them autonomy, they know what they're doing. They will create these magical little mosaic wetlands, like the terraces of a Chinese rice paddy or something. They build these little dams which sit with water and they hold the water back, they purify it, it creates habitat for fish and frogs and glowworms, as I've discovered, dragonflies and so on. They create natural corridors through the landscape for all species. All it takes is for us to just give another species, the beaver, autonomy in a small strip of land. We're talking 10 or 15 meters along a watercourse, and there's no conflict whatsoever.
Just finally, I know that you've said, you say in the book, very movingly at the close, that you feel very much that the project you've embarked on at your farm in Somerset is one that you work on in unison with Iris. I wondered what you would love her legacy to be.
So we've launched a thing, Kate and I, called the Iris Prize.
Kate is Iris's mum.
Kate is Iris's mother and my ex-wife. And we've launched the Iris Prize, which seeks to identify teenagers and young people across the world, and particularly in communities that are hard to reach, indigenous communities and so on, who are doing wonderful things to restore nature and the place that they live. And the goal is to lift them up, not just with a financial grant, but with mentorship, with local NGOs and with help with media and building their website. We had 3 winners last year in September 2022. What year are we in? September 2022. One in Indonesia who's working on reducing plastic pollution, another in Kenya who's working on mangroves, and an incredibly impressive young woman who's a teenager still in Malawi who's helping to expand clean cookers from people's homes, less deforestation, less pollution and so on. So I think Iris would have achieved extraordinary things had she lived on this earth. And I think in her name what we want to do is help other young people build a community who are doing amazing things similarly. So that's what we're doing to remember her.
Ben Goldsmith, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and I'm sure it's going to be a prize winner, though I'm sure that's not why you wrote it. God is an Octopus, Loss, Love and a Calling to Nature by Ben Goldsmith will be available to buy from tomorrow. That's May the 11th. And Ben also, though we didn't get a chance to talk about it, has embarked on a podcast which is called Rewilding the World with Ben Goldsmith, and I think is available next week, is it? Next week. Excellent. Thank you. Ben's nodding. He's thinking he's got to be quiet, but you can say yes.
Thank you very much, Mariella, for having me on.